The wolf should not have been there. That was the first thought that cut through Seren Ashvale's panic when she saw it standing at the edge of the tree line, perfectly still against the white curtain of the storm, its fur so pale that it was nearly invisible against the snow. She had been running for the better part of an hour, or at least what she believed was an hour, though time had become meaningless the moment the blizzard swallowed her camp whole and erased every landmark she had memorized with professional precision. Her maps were in the pack strapped to her back. Her compass was in her coat pocket. Neither of those things mattered when the forest looked the same in every direction, and the cold had begun to move past discomfort into something that felt dangerously close to acceptance. She stopped running. Her lungs burned. The wolf did not move. It was enormous. She knew enough about northern wolves to understand that what she was looking at did not follow the measurements she had recorded in the margins of her survey charts. Its shoulder reached her chest. Its eyes, when they caught a rare break in the storm's fury and reflected the gray light from above, were the color of ice over deep water, not the pale blue that poets romanticized, but the actual color of frozen things that had no warmth left to offer. She should have been afraid. Every rational part of her mind, the part that had kept her alive through 3 years of solitary cartographic work in territories that killed experienced scouts, was sending very clear signals that she should back away slowly and find another direction. Instead, she watched it turn and walk into the trees. It paused, looked back at her over its shoulder, with an expression that she would later struggle to describe to anyone who had not seen it, because wolves did not have expressions, not really. And yet this one communicated something with absolute clarity. It was waiting for her. It wanted her to follow. And Seren. Ashvale, whose professional survival had always depended on reading terrain and making decisions based on evidence rather than instinct, looked at the storm closing in behind her, looked at the vast white nothing in every other direction, and followed the wolf. She would think about that decision many times in the months that followed. She would turn it over in her mind during quiet moments and during loud ones, in warmth and in cold, in safety and in danger. She would ask herself whether she had truly chosen to follow, or whether something older than choice had simply moved her feet. She never arrived at a satisfying answer. But she followed, and the wolf led her through the dark of the Nordvast forest for 2 hours without once letting her fall too far behind, pausing whenever she stumbled, adjusting its pace to her struggling legs, until the trees thinned and the ground beneath the snow changed from soft earth to fitted stone, and she looked up and saw the walls of Vordheim rising. Out of the blizzard like something that had grown from the mountain, rather than been built upon it. The gates were iron and ancient, and covered in carvings she could not read in the storm's darkness. The wolf sat at the base of them and looked at her. Above the gates, she could see the orange glow of torches and shadows moving on the battlements, and she understood with a clarity that felt like cold water down her spine that she had been seen long before she reached the walls. The wolf made no sound. The gates opened anyway. "You are either very brave or very stupid," said the guard who met her on the other side. A woman built like a boulder with a scar across her jaw and eyes that had seen enough to stop being surprised by most things. She was looking at the wolf, not at Seren, and her expression was not the flat professionalism that Seren expected from a soldier. It was something closer to disbelief. "That is Frost," the guard said, mostly to herself. "Frost does not leave the inner keep." "He found me in the storm," Seren said, because that was the simplest accurate statement she could make. The guard looked at her then, really looked at her, with the kind of assessment that catalogued everything in under 3 seconds. Seren was aware of what she presented. A woman of moderate height, with dark brown hair plastered to her face by melted snow, wearing a cartographer's field coat that had been expensive 2 years ago, and was now merely functional, carrying a pack stuffed with rolled maps and surveying instruments, with no wolf behind her eyes, and no pack markings on her skin, and no power signature that any trained shifter would recognize. She was, by every metric that mattered in the Northern Territories, nobody. "Come with me," the guard said. Fordheim swallowed her whole. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. She had heard descriptions of Fordheim, of course. Every Samu cartographer who worked the Northern Territories collected descriptions of the places they had not yet mapped, building pictures from second-hand words and old drawings, and the occasional reliable account from traders who had approached its outer walls on business. She had a folder of such descriptions in her pack, annotated in her small, precise handwriting. None of them had prepared her for the reality of the place, which was not the dark fortress of rumor, but something stranger and more contradictory. The outer walls were military in their severity, but the inner courtyards were full of snow-dusted evergreens strung with lanterns, and the corridors she moved through were carved stone covered in murals that depicted not battles, as she would have expected, but landscapes, mountains and rivers and forests rendered in extraordinary detail by hands that clearly loved the land they were depicting. She was trying very hard not to stare. She was failing. The guard brought her to a room that was warm and clean and contained a fire, a bed, a table, a chair, and a tray of food that she fell upon with an embarrassing lack of dignity after 2 hours in the cold. She ate. She did not taste anything. When she was finished, she sat by the fire and waited, because it was obvious that her arrival had not gone unnoticed, and someone would come to determine what to do with her. She had not expected that someone to be the king. She heard him before she saw him. Not footsteps exactly, because he moved with the kind of silence that spoke of either extraordinary training or supernatural nature, probably both. She heard the change in the air when the door opened, a shift in pressure, in temperature, in the particular quality of stillness that had been occupying the room. She stood without thinking about it, which annoyed her, because she had spent years deliberately unlearning the instinct to make herself smaller in the presence of powerful people. Calder Stormvale was tall in the way that winter mountains were tall, not merely as a measurement, but as a quality of presence that reorganized the space around him. He had dark hair and a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, and eyes that were the same color as his wolf's, which she had not expected, and which struck her with a force that was almost physical. He was wearing traveling clothes rather than anything ceremonial, which meant either that he had not expected to deal with this tonight, or that he had deliberately chosen not to dress the encounter in formality. She could not decide which interpretation was more unsettling. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. She held his gaze, because she had learned long ago that the first person to look away in a silence like this was the person who had already lost something, and she did not intend to lose anything she had not yet been asked to give. "Frost brought you," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "Frost has never brought anyone." "I gathered that from the guard's reaction," she said. "I am sorry if my arrival caused disruption. I was caught in the storm and he found me in the forest. I followed him because the alternative was freezing to death. If you would prefer I leave at first light, I will happily do so." She paused. "I am a cartographer. I was contracted to survey the boundary territories. I have no political interests in Fordheim and no affiliations that should concern you." He was still, looking at her with that particular quality of attention that made her feel simultaneously seen and measured. "A cartographer with no pack," he said. "Correct. Mapping the boundary territories alone. Also correct. That is either impressive or reckless," he said, and something in his voice shifted in a way she could not immediately identify. "Most things worth doing are both," she said. The silence that followed was different from the one before it. She was not sure she could have articulated the difference, only that it existed, and that something in the room had changed with her last words, some small recalibration of the distance between them. He nodded once, slowly, as if she had confirmed something he had wondered about rather than answered a question he had asked. Then he said that she would stay until the storm passed, and that a member of his staff would come in the morning to discuss the terms of her extended stay if she wished to continue her surveying work from within Vordheim's territory, rather than exposed camps in the wilds. He left without ceremony. Frost, who had apparently followed him into the room without her noticing, paused in the doorway and looked at her one more time with those unreadable glacier eyes before disappearing after his king. Seren sat back down beside the fire and told herself, very firmly, that she was here by accident and would be leaving as soon as the weather permitted. She told herself this several more times before she fell asleep in the chair, still in her coat, her pack propped against the wall beside her, as if she might need to run at a moment's notice. She had spent 3 years learning to sleep lightly. She did not believe in letting herself get comfortable in places she had not mapped. The morning brought clarity in the way that mornings after storms always did, that particular quality of light reflecting off fresh snow that made everything look cleaner than it was. It also brought Lady Isadora Vane, which complicated the clarity considerably. Lady Vane arrived with the kind of entrance that had been carefully constructed to look effortless, which Seren recognized because she had spent enough time in enough courts adjacent to power to know the difference between someone who moved beautifully naturally and someone who had practiced moving beautifully until it became indistinguishable from natural. She was everything that Seren was not, which Seren suspected was precisely the point of this early morning visit. Tall, elegant, dressed in furs that probably cost more than Seren's entire survey equipment, with golden hair and the particular brand of confidence that came from having always been the most important woman in any room she entered. She sat down across from Seren without being invited to do so, which was itself a communication, and smiled with a warmth that did not reach her eyes at all. "You are the cartographer," she said, in the tone of someone identifying a curiosity, rather than greeting a person. "Seren Ashveil," Seren said, because she had learned that offering your name first in situations like this was a form of controlled vulnerability that tended to disarm people who expected defensiveness. "How charming," Lady Vane said, without specifying what exactly she found charming. "It is extraordinary what Frost did. I have never seen him leave the inner keep before. The staff has been talking about nothing else since last night." She tilted her head. "Slightly. You must be very interesting. Or very lost," Seren said pleasantly. Lady Vane smiled again, and this time there was something sharper underneath it. A recalibration, the smile of a woman who had expected to find a rabbit and was considering the possibility that she had found something that bit. "Tell me about your work," she said, leaning back in her chair with the studied ease of someone who had decided to take a longer look before deciding how to proceed. "Cartography is such a solitary pursuit. You must be very self-sufficient." "It requires it," Seren agreed. "And you have no pack? No family connections in the Northern Territories?" "None," Seren said. "Remarkable," Lady Vane said, in a way that made the word mean something slightly different from its definition. She stayed for another 20 minutes, asking questions that were all technically innocuous, and collectively building a picture that Seren understood she was meant to feel the weight of. The picture was of a woman who was alone, who had no backing, who was here by accident, who had no claim on anything within these walls, and should not imagine otherwise. It was elegantly done. Seren gave her the minimum required to be polite, and the maximum required to be interesting. And when Lady Vane finally left, trailing expensive fur and expensive perfume, and the ghost of a warning, Seren sat quietly for a moment and considered what she had just walked into. Then she opened her pack and took out her mapping journal and began to write. The terms that Calder's seneschal, a dry, precise man named Aldrich, proposed were straightforward. In exchange for lodging and access to Vordheim's considerable library of historical surveys, Seren would spend 4 weeks mapping the interior corridors and subterranean passages of the citadel itself, work that apparently had not been done in any systematic way in over 200 years. The existing maps were contradictory and incomplete. There were corridors that did not connect to each other in ways the map suggested they should. There were rooms that appeared on one map and not another. There were descending passages that the records noted as sealed, but which Aldrich admitted, with the careful honesty of a man who disliked admitting anything, had not actually been verified as sealed in living memory. It was, from a purely professional standpoint, the most interesting cartographic project she had ever been offered. She agreed without negotiating, which surprised Aldrich, and then added a single condition. She worked alone and at her own pace, without escort, because an escort changed the way a space felt, and she needed to feel spaces accurately to map them well. Aldrich took this condition to the king. The king sent back a 2-word reply, "Granted," and her name. She began that same afternoon. Vordheim was larger than it appeared from outside. This was the first thing she recorded in her journal, along with the observation that the discrepancy was not architectural illusion, but the result of significant underground construction that extended far beyond the footprint of the surface buildings. The sublevels went down in stages, each one older than the one above it, the stone changing character as she descended, from the dressed and fitted construction of the upper levels to the rougher work of earlier builders, and finally, in the deepest passages she located in her first week, to stone that had clearly not been shaped by human or shifter, hands at all, but appeared to have been formed by some process she could not identify, smooth and dark, and faintly warm to the touch despite being deep underground. She found him on the 3rd day, not in the way she had expected to encounter the King of Vordheim again. She had half expected formal meetings, perhaps queries about her progress delivered through Aldrich. What she had not expected was to turn a corner in a sublevel corridor that her preliminary maps suggested was entirely unused and find Calder Stormvale sitting on a stone bench in a chamber that someone had clearly been using as a quiet place for a very long time. There was a lantern. There were books. There was a cup of something hot, carefully covered to retain warmth. There was the wolf, Frost, curled at his feet with the spectacular indifference of an animal that was precisely where it intended to be. They looked at each other. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "I apologize," she said. "I did not know this chamber was occupied. I will mark it as private on my maps." "You do not need to," he said. He did not look particularly surprised to see her, which she filed away to think about later. "How is the survey progressing?" She told him, honestly and in more detail than she had given Aldrich, because she was still in the mode of talking about her work, and he had asked a genuine question. She told him about the discrepancies between the existing maps and the actual layout, about the sublevels, about the stone at the bottom that did not match any construction she had documented elsewhere. He listened with the particular quality of attention that she was beginning to recognize as specific to him, total and unperforming, without the glances toward doors or the slight physical restlessness that indicated a person waiting for their turn to speak. "The deep stone is older than Vordheim," he said when she had finished. "It is older than the pack. We believe it is the reason the first Alpha chose this location to build. There is something in it that resonates with what we carry." He paused. "No cartographer has been down that far before." "I am thorough," she said. Something crossed his face that she thought might be the beginning of a smile. "I have been told," he said. She left him there and continued her mapping. But she thought about the warmth of that deep stone for the rest of the afternoon, and the way he had said resonates, as if he were speaking about music rather than architecture. And she was not sure why those particular words stayed with her when so much else from the day did not. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below. The court noticed her. She had not expected to be invisible exactly, but she had hoped to be uninteresting, and in this she was disappointed. The problem, she came to understand, was Frost. The wolf appeared without pattern or warning at various points during her workday, sometimes walking beside her through corridors, sometimes simply being present in a room when she entered it, once sitting at the door of the library when she arrived to cross-reference historical records, and apparently remaining there for 2 hours until she emerged. The court interpreted Frost's interest as meaningful in a way that made Seren deeply uncomfortable, because she understood enough about shifter culture to know that a bonded animal who was not a person's own wolf was not supposed to do any of the things Frost was doing, and the explanations being offered in the whispered conversations she was not supposed to hear ranged from ominous to politically explosive. Lady Vane's visits became more frequent and more precisely calibrated. She never said anything that could be called a threat. She was too elegant for that, too politically experienced. What she did was tell stories, carefully selected stories about other women who had come to Vordheim and misunderstood the nature of their welcome, about the long history of the Pax alliances and the importance of stable governance, about Calder's responsibilities and the weight they placed on his choices. The stories were beautifully told, and their subtext was entirely clear. Seren listened to all of them with an expression of polite interest, and said nothing that gave Lady Vane anything to work with, which she could see frustrated the woman in ways she was too controlled to show directly. The male members of the court were a different kind of problem. Not aggressive, exactly, but assessing. A beta named Corvin, who held some kind of administrative role, spent 3 separate occasions manufacturing reasons to encounter her in the library, and on each occasion asked her questions that were ostensibly about her work and were actually about her origins, her family, her pack history. She answered truthfully because the truth was unremarkable. She had been born to a mother who was human, and a father she had never met. She had grown up in the South. She had found cartography at 16 when a traveling surveyor had taken her on as an assistant, and she had been working independently since she was 20. No pack, no wolf, no supernatural inheritance of any kind. Corvin looked at her after this last statement with an expression she could not interpret. "And yet, Frost brought you," he said. "And yet Frost brought me," she agreed. She did not tell him that Frost had also taken to sleeping outside her door at night. She was not sure how to explain that without making it sound more significant than she was prepared to acknowledge. Calder found her in the deep levels again on the 8th day, and this time he had not arrived with books or a covered cup of something hot. He was there the way she sometimes found him when she looked up from her mapping work in the library, simply present, watching her work with that quality of attention that she had stopped finding unnerving and started finding comfortable without entirely meaning. 2. "You mapped the 4th sublevel today," he said. He must have spoken to Aldrich. "Yes. There is a chamber down there that does not appear on any of your existing records." She opened her mapping journal to the page she had been working on and showed him. "Here. The proportions are strange. The ceiling is higher than the level above should permit, geometrically. And the floor is marked with something I have not been able to identify." He looked at her map for a long moment. Then he looked at her, and there was something in his expression that she could not read at all. Something that was not the careful neutrality she had observed him deploying in court contexts. "I have been in that chamber," he said. "Once. I was 17. My father showed it to me the day before he died." He paused. "He called it the founding chamber. He said I would know what it meant when the time came." "What does it mean?" she asked. "I did not know," he said, "until 8 days ago." The silence that followed was one of the charged ones, full of things neither of them was saying. Seren was very good at silence. She had learned to be in 3 years of solitary work in territories where talking to yourself was the first sign of a particular kind of going wrong. But this silence required something she did not have a professional skill for. And after a moment, she closed her mapping journal and said, with the careful precision she applied to measurements, "You should say what you mean. I have found that indirect communication is inefficient and usually benefits the person with more to hide." He looked at her for a long breath. Then he said, "Come with me." She followed him. The founding chamber was exactly where she had mapped it, and it was exactly as strange as her measurements had suggested. The ceiling soared in a way that defied the architectural logic of the levels above it. The floor was dark stone, the same warm, smooth stone she had identified in the deepest passages. But here it was marked with carvings that covered every surface, dense and intricate and clearly significant, though she had not been able to read them on her previous visit because she had been focused on measuring the space rather than studying its contents. She was studying them now. She moved to the nearest carved section and crouched to look closely, and felt the hair rise on the back of her neck, because she recognized the figure at the center of the largest carving. Not the figure exactly. The symbol the figure was holding, an 8-pointed geometric shape with a small circle at its center, rendered in the slightly irregular lines of something carved by hand rather than machine. She sat back on her heels and pulled up her left sleeve. The birthmark on her inner wrist was small and easy to miss. An 8-pointed geometric shape with a small circle at its center. Calder was watching her. He had been watching her since they entered the chamber. "How long have you known?" she asked. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which she was grateful for. "Since the night Frost brought you," he said. "When you walked through the gate, every ward in the Citadel lit up for the first time in 300 years. The old wards. The founding wards. My grandfather's grandfather could not activate them, and neither could anyone since." He paused. "They respond to founding blood. The records say the first Alpha built Fordheim with his mate, a woman who was a cartographer and who carried a bloodline older than the pack histories. They called her the First Reader. The wards were keyed to her blood and to his, and when both were present together, the Citadel recognized itself as complete." Another pause, longer. "The night you arrived, every ward in Fordheim lit simultaneously for the first time in 300 years. Seren stared at the carving for a long time. She was a professional who dealt in facts, in measurements, in the concrete reality of terrain and structure, and spatial relationship. She was also someone who had followed a white wolf through a blizzard on nothing but instinct, and who had known since the moment she saw Calder Stormveil standing in her doorway that something in her had recognized something in him that her rational mind had absolutely refused to examine. She sat with all of that for a moment. Then she looked up at him. "You could have told me on the first night," she said. "You would have left," he said. Simply, without apology. "I still might," she said. Though even as she said it, she was aware that it was only half true, and decreasing toward quarter true, at a pace she was not comfortable with. "I know," he said. "That is why I am telling you now, rather than waiting until you cannot." She looked back at the carving. Her mark. Her impossible, inconvenient, 300-year-old bloodline, and the Citadel that had been waiting for it. She was aware that this was the moment where a sensible person would take a breath and request time to think. And she was also aware that she was already thinking. Had been thinking since the moment she walked through those iron gates, and that what she was thinking was not moving in the direction of sensible at all. "I need to finish mapping the sublevels," she said. "I know," he said again. "And I have questions. A significant number of questions about everything you just told me, and I expect thorough answers. I will provide them. And I am not agreeing to anything," she said. "I am simply noting that the cartographic work here is the most interesting I have ever encountered, and that I would like to continue it." "Of course," he said. His voice was perfectly neutral. His eyes were not neutral at all. She stood up and tugged her sleeve back down, and looked at the chamber one more time. The carvings looked back at her with the patience of things that had been waiting for a very long time, and had learned not to be in a hurry. "Fine," she said. "Show me the rest of what you know about this chamber." He showed her. They were in the founding chamber for 3 hours, and when they finally emerged into the upper levels, the lanterns in the corridor seemed brighter than they had been when she descended. though she could not say objectively whether they were, or whether something about the quality of her own attention had simply changed. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. Lady Vane knew. She did not know the specifics, but she knew that something had shifted, and she was not the kind of woman who permitted significant shifts in her territory to go unaddressed. The morning after Seren's visit to the founding chamber, Isadora appeared not in Seren's room but in the corridor outside the library, at an hour that was early enough to suggest deliberate timing rather than coincidence, with two of her attendants arranged slightly behind her in a formation that was meant to suggest casual accompaniment and actually suggested something closer to reinforcement. "I hope you are settling in well," she said, with her beautiful, warm smile. "Fordheim can feel quite overwhelming to those who are not accustomed to it. I find it straightforward once you have the correct maps," Seren said. Lady Vane's eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. "I wanted to speak with you, woman to woman. I think you are intelligent enough to appreciate directness." She tilted her head. "What has happened here, whatever Frost has done, whatever stories the staff are telling each other, it is not what it appears. Calder has obligations that have been in place for years, alliances that the pack depends on. I do not say this to be unkind. I say it because someone should, and because I think you would prefer the truth to pleasant fictions." Seren looked at her for a moment. Lady Vane was not wrong that she preferred the truth. She was also not entirely wrong about the alliances and the obligations, which Seren had heard enough about in her time at Fordheim to know were real and complicated. She was, however, working from an incomplete picture, and Seren, whose professional life consisted of identifying exactly what was missing from incomplete pictures, was acutely aware of what Lady Vane did not know. "I appreciate the directness," Seren said. "I will offer the same in return. I am here to do cartographic work. I have made no claims and no demands. Whatever you believe I represent, it was not chosen or planned by me." She paused. "If Calder has obligations to you, that conversation is between you and Calder. I am a cartographer. That is all." Lady Vane studied her for a moment, with the eyes of a woman who had been in enough political situations to know when someone was telling the truth and when they were withholding something. Then she nodded, once, with the careful grace of a person who had decided to retreat to higher ground, to reconsider her approach. "Of course," she said. She left. Seren stood in the corridor for a moment after she was gone, aware that she had said "I am a cartographer" with less certainty than she had possessed 2 weeks ago, and that this erosion was her own doing, and she was not sure she had the will to reverse it. Corvin found her that afternoon, not with questions this time, but with information, which was a different and more interesting development. He was waiting for her outside the mapping room she had commandeered as her workspace, with the expression of a man who had made a decision that he was not entirely comfortable with, but had made regardless. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Not as a member of this court, but as someone who has known Calder since we were children." He waited for her nod before continuing. "Lady Vane's alliance is a political arrangement. It has never been a mate bond, and Calder has never claimed otherwise. The arrangement was made by the council during a period when Calder had just taken the throne and needed certain border territories to stabilize. It has always been understood, by everyone except possibly Isadora herself, to be temporary." He paused. "I tell you this because Frost has chosen you, and in the 26 years I have known that wolf, he has chosen no one. And because Calder has spent 11 years making decisions for this pack that have cost him everything he would have chosen for himself. And I think it would be very good if, for once, something came to him without cost." Seren absorbed this. She thought of Calder in the sub-level chamber with his books and his covered cup, alone in a space that no one apparently knew he used. She thought of the way he listened without performing listening. She thought of 11 years of choices that cost him things he did not name. "Thank you," she said, and meant it completely. She found him that evening, Not in the founding chamber, and not in the library, and not in any of the formal spaces where their interactions had been watched and catalogued by interested observers. She found him on the outer battlements, in the cold and the dark, with Frost at his side, and the northern lights beginning to move across the sky in their indifferent, magnificent way. He heard her coming, and did not turn around, which meant he had known it was her before she arrived, and had chosen to wait, rather than prepare. "Corvin told me about the alliance," she said, coming to stand beside him at the wall. She looked at the lights, rather than at him. The actual nature of it. "He should not have," Calder said, but without heat. "He is trying to help you," Seren said. "He is worried about you, I think. Or for you. He worries too much." "Perhaps," she said. "Or perhaps he sees things you have stopped being able to see, because you are standing too close to them." She was quiet for a moment, watching the lights shift. "I owe you a conversation about the founding chamber. Not about the ward or the bloodline or the history. About what I feel when I'm in it." She paused. "About what I feel when I am in this citadel. About what I have felt since the night your wolf walked into the trees, and I was too cold and too frightened to be rational about whether following him was a good idea." He turned to look at her then. She made herself meet his eyes, because she was not someone who said difficult things while looking at the sky. "I have no pack," she said. "I have no wolf. I have a birthmark that apparently carries 300 years of significance and a set of skills that are useful to you for reasons I am only beginning to understand. I am not in the habit of belonging anywhere, and I am not certain I know how. I have spent 3 years mapping territories where nothing belongs to anyone, and I have found that very comfortable." She paused again. "I am telling you this not as a warning, but as honesty, because you told me you waited to speak until I could not leave, and I think you deserve to know what you are actually asking me to stay for." Calder was quiet for a long moment. The lights moved overhead. Frost pressed his enormous head against Seren's hand, with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "I am not asking you to belong," Calder said finally. "I am asking you to map." A pause, and then, quieter. "Everything else would be something we figure out, if you are willing." She looked at him. He looked back. Between them, in the cold and the dark and the light, something settled into place with the particular quiet solidity of a piece of terrain that had finally been correctly identified on a map, not conquered or claimed but understood, documented, seen for what it actually was. "I am willing," she said. She did not sleep on the battlements. She went back to her room and to her work and to the careful progress of her maps. And nothing outwardly changed, except that when she passed Calder in the library the following morning, and he met her eyes, the quality of it was different from before. More open, less armored, carrying the weight of the previous night's conversation like a stone carried in a pocket, present and specific, and hers. She found the lower corridor on the 14th day. It was below the founding chamber, below the warm, dark stone she had thought was the lowest level. There was a seam in the wall of the chamber's east side that her measurements had flagged as anomalous, a half-centimeter variation in the plumb of the stonework that indicated either poor original construction, which nothing else in the deep levels suggested, or a door that had been closed for long enough to settle into its frame so completely that it was only distinguishable by the mathematics of its surroundings. She had come back to verify her measurement 3 times before she was willing to call it definitive. She called it definitive on the 14th day. She pressed the seam with her fingers, which accomplished nothing. She pressed it with a flat piece of metal from her surveying kit, applying gentle leverage at the geometric center of the anomaly, and felt something give that was not quite mechanical and not quite architectural, more like a held breath being released. The door opened. What was beyond it was not a passage. It was a room, a single circular room carved from the warm, dark stone, with a ceiling so low she had to bend to enter, and a floor that was a single, unbroken carved surface. every centimeter of it covered in the same intricate marking language she had found in the founding. Chamber, but denser, more complete, the full version of what she had only seen in fragments before. At the center of the floor was a raised circle, a dais, barely elevated, just enough to be deliberate, and at its center was a depression in the shape of an 8-pointed geometric figure with a circle at its center. She knew what it was before she understood that she knew. Her hand had already moved to her sleeve, already pushed the fabric up to expose her wrist, before her rational mind had finished cataloging the space. She looked at the mark on her skin and at the depression in the stone, and understood, with the complete and unambiguous certainty that she reserved for things she had measured 3 times, that her mother's birthmark explanation had been not a lie but an incompleteness, that her mother had perhaps not known, that the mark had been waiting, as the wards had been waiting, as the founding chamber had been waiting, as Vordheim itself had been waiting, for the particular convergence of circumstances that had brought Seren Ashvale through an iron gate in a blizzard following a white wolf. She went to get Calder. She found him, as she was beginning to expect she would find him in moments like this, without needing to search extensively. He was in the library. She told him what she had found with the brevity of someone who understood that words were a map, and maps should be accurate rather than ornate. He came immediately, without ceremony, with Frost, following them both down through the sublevels at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow, but possessed of a kind of inevitability. He stopped in the doorway of the circular room. He looked at the floor, at the dais, at the depression. He looked at her. "The founding records describe this room," he said. "They call it the Root. They say the Pack's connection to its territory is renewed here. They say the ceremony requires 2 participants." He paused. "The first Alpha and the first Reader." "Their descendants," she said. "Yes." "And if this ceremony is performed," she said, because she was a cartographer and she dealt in precision, "what does it do?" "It renews the claiming of the territory," he said. "Not metaphorically, literally. The wards, the bonds, the Pack's connection to this land. It restores what has been weakening for 3 centuries. He was quiet for a moment. "It also binds the participants, in the old way, in the way that cannot be undone." She looked at the floor. She looked at the mark on her wrist. She thought about 3 years of solitary mapping in territories where nothing belonged to anyone, and about the particular quality of comfort she had attributed to freedom, and was now beginning to wonder if had actually been the comfort of not being asked to risk anything real. She thought about his wolf sleeping outside her door. She thought about a man who had spent 11 years making decisions that cost him what he would have chosen for himself. She thought about following an enormous white wolf through a blizzard because the alternative was freezing to death, and how that decision, which had felt like desperation, had led her to the most interesting cartographic project of her career, and to a chamber beneath the earth that had been waiting 300 years to be found by someone whose blood was the key, and whose hands were trained to find things hidden in the mathematics of spaces. She looked at Calder. "Not tonight," she said. "I want to finish mapping the room first. I want to understand it completely before we make any decision about it." She paused. "But I am not saying no. I want that to be clear. I am saying not yet." He nodded slowly. His eyes were not neutral, and she had stopped pretending they were. "Not yet," he agreed. "And I want to speak with Lady Vane," she said. "Myself. Directly. Before anything else happens." She saw his expression shift slightly. "Not because I owe her anything. Because I believe she deserves the dignity of a direct conversation with the person whose presence affects her situation, rather than learning through court gossip." He looked at her for a moment, with the expression she had begun to think of as the one he had when she said something he had not anticipated. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. She spent 3 more days mapping the route before she felt she understood it well enough to say she knew what it was. On the 4th day, She requested a meeting with Lady Vane. Isadora came to her this time, which was itself a small reversal, and she came alone, without her attendants, which was either a concession or a calculation. Seren thought it was probably both. She received her in the mapping room, surrounded by her work, which was both comfortable territory and a deliberate choice about how she wanted this conversation to go. "You know why I asked to speak with you," Seren said. "I do," Lady Vane said. She was composed, beautifully and expensively composed. But, Seren could see in the set of her shoulders, and the particular quality of her stillness, that the composure was being maintained rather than simply existing. "Then you know that I did not come here to take anything from you," Seren said. "What I am is not something I chose or engineered. I understand that does not make it easier." Lady Vane was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was measured, but carried something underneath that Seren recognized as the particular exhaustion of someone who has been performing strength for a very long time. "I have given 8 years to this alliance," she said. 8 years of political work, of positioning, of being everything that was required. I am not angry at you. I want you to know that. I am angry at circumstances, which is a much less useful thing to be. A pause. What I am asking is for this to be handled with appropriate dignity, for the pack and for myself. That is what I am asking too, Seren said. Exactly that. They looked at each other across the mapped surface of the table between them. Two women who had been placed in opposition by forces neither of them had entirely controlled, finding in each other, carefully and without rushing, something that was not quite friendship, but was the beginning of a respect that did not require either of them to be smaller than they were. "He would not have been happy," Lady Vane said finally. Not a question. "No," Seren said honestly. "I do not think he would have." "I know that," Isadora said. And then, after a long moment, "The North needs stability. What I have built here, the alliances, the relationships, the political architecture, they do not disappear, because my personal position in them changes." She looked at Seren with the direct assessment of a woman deciding something. "The work matters regardless. I intend to continue it." "I think that would be good for everyone," Seren said, and meant it. Lady Vane nodded once, with the precision of someone filing something. Under concluded, and stood. At the door she paused and looked back, and for a moment her expression was simply that of a woman who had not gotten what she had worked for and was choosing to carry it with grace rather than bitterness. "You are not what I expected," she said. "I am rarely what people expect," Seren said. The ghost of a genuine smile crossed Isadora's face. Then she was gone. Seren sat for a long time afterward, and when she finally picked up her mapping tools again, she noticed that her hands were steady and her measurements were precise, and that the quality of the afternoon light coming through the narrow stone windows of her workspace was particularly clear. The ceremony of the root required a full moon. There was one in 9 days. She did not rush toward it, and she did not flee from it. She spent those 9 days completing her maps of the sublevels with the thoroughness that her professional standards demanded, and she spent time in the library reading the Kaum, founding records that Calder unlocked for her with quiet ceremony, records that had not been opened in 100 years, and that smelled of cold stone and old certainty. She spent time with Frost, who had stopped pretending that he was not attached to her, and simply went where she went with the magnificent indifference of a creature that had decided the situation was settled, even if the humans were still catching up. She spent time with Calder, not in any dramatic way. They did not have the kind of charged and significant conversations that she had been taught, by a lifetime of cultural consumption, to expect from situations like this one. They talked about the founding records. They talked about pack history and cartographic history, and the places where those two histories overlapped in ways that neither tradition had fully documented. They talked about his childhood in Vordheim, and her childhood in the South, and the particular qualities of loneliness that came from being very capable, and having nobody who fully understood what that capability cost. They walked the battlements with Frost between them in the evenings and watched the northern lights perform their slow and indifferent theater overhead. On the 5th day, he took her hand while they were walking. Not dramatically, simply, as if it were a decision that had already been made, and he was only now catching up to its physical expression. She did not pull away. They walked in silence for a while, with the cold pressing in. On both sides and Frost ahead of them, his white shape moving through the dark like something made of moonlight rather than flesh. "I should tell you," she said, "that I am not particularly good at staying in one place." "I know," he said. "I have spent 3 years not staying in one place." "I know that too." "Vordheim is very mapped," she said. "Once I have finished the sublevels, there is not much left that requires the kind of systematic attention that I am trained to give. There are 37 other territories under the Northern Pact's governance," he said. "None of them have been accurately mapped in 150 years. Several of them have not been mapped at all." A pause. "I have been told that this is a significant administrative problem." She looked at him. "I would not require you to stay," he said. "I would require you to come back." She was quiet for a long moment. She was a person who dealt in precision, and she was being precise about what he was. Offering, which was not a cage dressed up as a home, but an actual negotiation between what she was and what she was being asked to become. She thought about coming back, about having a place to come back to, which was different from any place she had slept in 3 years of fieldwork, which were all places she was temporarily not leaving, rather than places she was planning to return to. About the particular weight of the word return, which implied a direction, which implied a center. About the fact that every time she had left a camp in 3 years, the leaving had felt like nothing, and that the thought of leaving Vordheim felt like something specific and located and not entirely comfortable and absolutely real. 37 territories, she said. "At minimum," he said. "That is a significant amount of cartographic work." "It is," he agreed. "I would want access to all the historical records, not just the ones that have been cleared. All of them. Done. And I would need a proper workspace, not a repurposed storage room. I will have one built to your specifications. And I want Frost to stop sleeping outside my door," she said. "It is strange." He was quiet for one breath. Then he said very carefully, "He can sleep inside your door instead." She laughed. It came out of her without preparation or performance, the genuine unguarded sound of someone who had not laughed like that in a while and had missed the feeling without knowing it. He looked at her. When she laughed with the expression of someone who had been given something unexpectedly precious and was not sure yet how to hold it without breaking it. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. The full moon came on a clear night, which felt either significant or coincidental, and probably was both. The court had been told only that an old ceremony was to be performed, one from the founding records, a renewal of the Pact's territorial bonds. This was true, and was also deliberately incomplete, which Seren had come to understand was sometimes necessary in political contexts, not as deception, but as pacing, giving people the true story in the sequence they could absorb it, rather than all at once in a volume that overwhelmed comprehension. She descended to the root with Calder and Frost and Aldrich, who served as witness, and who had absorbed the information about Seren's bloodline, with the careful composure of a man who was already revising every document that would need to be revised in light of this information, and was prioritizing his revision list. The circular room looked different by moonlight that came through some vent or aperture she had not identified in her mapping. A thin, precise bar of silver light that fell directly on the central dais. She added this to her mental list of things she needed to document before it was anyone's list but her own. She and Calder stood at the center of the dais, facing each other, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him across the small, cold air between them. Frost sat at the room's edge and watched with his glacier eyes and his magnificent, unhurried patience. "I want to say something first," she said, "before we do this." "Of course," he said. She had thought about what she wanted to say for 9 days, and she had not written it down, which was unusual for her, because she was a person who committed important things to paper. She had not written it down because she had wanted it to be immediate rather than prepared, subject to the actual conditions of the moment, rather than planned in advance. She looked at him now in the thin silver light, and found that the words she had been accumulating all week were simpler than she had expected. "I have been mapping other people's territories my entire adult life," she said. "I have documented spaces that belong to other people. I have measured and recorded and moved on. I have been very good at moving on." She paused. "I did not expect to find a space that was waiting. For me specifically. I did not expect that following a wolf through a blizzard was going to lead to something that required me to stay." Another pause. "But I am not sorry it did. I want you to know that. Whatever this is, whatever it becomes, I am not sorry." He looked at her for a moment, that stretched out past its edges. Then he said, quietly, and with complete certainty, "Neither am I." She pressed her wrist to the depression in the stone, the warmth that had been present in the deep stone. Throughout the citadel became something else entirely. Not heat, but a resonance, a vibration at a frequency she felt in her bones rather than heard with her ears, moving up her arm and through her chest and into whatever part of her responded to things that were older and deeper than conscious thought. The carvings on the floor illuminated, not with fire or electricity, but with their own light, a pale, steady glow that spread outward from the dais in concentric rings until the entire floor was visible, and the walls were visible, and the low ceiling was visible, and everything in the circular room was precisely and completely itself. Calder breathed in sharply. She felt his hand find hers, not reaching for the depression, but holding her, just holding her, as the light grew and the resonance deepened, and somewhere above them, she would learn later, every ward in Vordheim lit simultaneously and remained lit, steady and permanent, for the first time in 300 years. Frost raised his head and made a sound she had never heard a wolf make, a single clear note that was not a howl exactly, but contained everything a howl contained, recognition and territory, and the particular joy of something lost being found. She did not cry. She was not someone who cried easily, but she felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was held tight, something that had been contracted since long before she entered this citadel, something she had mistaken for self-sufficiency and was only now identifying correctly as loneliness that had become so familiar she had stopped noticing it. She looked at Calder. He was looking at her. The light from the floor cast everything in silver, and the resonance was still moving through her, and she thought, with the precise, clear certainty she reserved for things she had measured 3 times and found consistent. Yes, this, here. Well, she said, because she was a cartographer, and cartographers dealt in the concrete and the measurable. The wards appear to be functioning. He laughed. Unexpected and genuine and warm. The laugh of a man who had not laughed like that in a long time and was relearning how it felt. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her wrist, to the mark, and she felt the resonance shift into something that was no longer ancient history, or territorial politics, or the weight of 300 years of waiting, but simply the present moment, immediate and specific, and entirely theirs. The wards appeared to be functioning, he agreed. Above them, in the great hall of Vordheim, the ancient lanterns that had not burned in 3 centuries ignited without any human hand touching them, filling the space with a warm and steady light. The pack, gathered in the hall for the evening meal, went completely silent, and then, slowly, one by one, and then all together, they turned toward the source of the light, and they understood. In the deep stone below them, in a circular room that had been waiting for exactly this convergence of person and place and time. A cartographer put her head against the shoulder of a king and let herself be, for the first time in a very long time, in a place she did not intend to leave. The court assembled the following morning in the great hall with the ancient lantern still burning overhead, their light steady and gold and impossible to argue with. Seren stood at Calder's left with Frost between them and Aldrich to one side, with a scroll he had spent the entire night preparing. She was wearing her field coat, which was still the most functional thing she owned, and she had her mapping journal under her arm, because she had decided that if there was going to be a public moment, she was going to be recognizably herself in it, rather than dressed up as something she was not. Lady Vane was in the front of the assembly. She was composed and elegant, and her expression was the studied neutrality of a woman who had decided how she was going to carry this, and was carrying it. When Seren met her eyes briefly, Isadora gave her a small, precise nod. Seren returned it. Calder spoke with the brevity of someone who understood that the light overhead was already saying most of what needed to be said. He told the pack the history of the founding chamber, and the root, and the founding bloodline that had gone unrecognized for 3 centuries. He told them what the wards meant, and what the renewal meant, and what Seren Ashvale, cartographer of the boundary territories, was and had always been, even before either of them understood it. He did not speak about what would come next in the personal sense, because he was a private person, and because he had asked her what she wanted, and she had told him she preferred to let the work speak for itself. The pack listened. They were a group of people who had grown up understanding that their citadel's ancient wards had faded, and had accepted this as one of the irreversible losses of time. The lanterns above. Their heads were not a metaphor or a political statement. They were simply the evidence, concrete and warm and undeniable, of something being restored that had been incomplete. Corvin, somewhere in the middle of the assembly, was smiling with the particular satisfaction of a person who saw something coming that everyone else missed, and has had the grace to be happy about being right. She caught his eye, and he gave her a nod that acknowledged both the rightness and the friendship underneath it. After the formal portion was concluded, and the assembly had dispersed into the particular busy murmur of a community processing significant information, Seren went back to her mapping room. She had work to do. The sublevels were documented, but not yet fully cross-referenced with the existing records, and the circular room of the route needed to be mapped with the precision that its importance warranted, and there were 37 territories waiting that had not seen a competent cartographer in 150 years. She spread her maps on the table and began to work. Frost came and lay under the table, warm and substantial against her feet. Through the narrow stone window, she could hear the sounds of Vordheim going about its mourning, voices and movement and the particular acoustic quality of a citadel that was, she was beginning to understand, not merely a fortress, but a community, full of all the complicated and irreducible life that communities contained. After a while there were footsteps in the corridor, and the door opened, and Calder came in carrying 2 cups of something hot, one of which he set at her elbow with the practiced care of someone who had learned not to put things on top of maps. He sat in the chair across from her and opened one of the founding records that had become a shared project over the past weeks, and the silence between them had the quality of a thing that had been correctly mapped, neither too full nor too empty, spacious and specific and entirely sufficient. She reached for the cup without looking up from her work. It was warm, and it tasted of something spiced and northern that she did not have a name for yet, but was learning to recognize. Outside the window, the morning was moving forward, unhurried and complete, and the lanterns in the great hall burned on, steady as something that has finally found its way home. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming? She did not stop mapping the day after the ceremony, or the day after that. She had built her entire professional identity around the discipline of showing up to the work, regardless of what had happened the day before. And this discipline did not dissolve simply because the work had acquired a permanent address. If anything, it sharpened, because she had more now, more stake in the accuracy of what she produced, more understanding of what the maps she made would mean to the people who would use them. She mapped the route with the thoroughness it deserved, spending 4 full days on the circular room alone, documenting not just the spatial dimensions, but the carvings themselves, creating for the first time a complete visual record of the inscriptions that covered every surface, copying them with the patient precision of someone who understood that a thing unrecorded is a thing that can be lost again. She cross-referenced them with the founding records. She found correspondences and discrepancies in the places where the records were incomplete, and the carvings filled the gaps, and she began to understand that the ancient language of the deep stone was not decorative, but functional, a kind of instruction set, a set of directions for exactly the kind of renewal that had just occurred, written in a form that only the right hands could follow. She presented her completed maps of the sublevels to Aldrich in the second week after the ceremony, bound in the leather covers she reserved for archival work. He received them with a reverence that surprised her until she remembered that he had spent his entire career working in a citadel, whose own interior was imperfectly known, navigating corridors that contradicted their records and making administrative decisions based on incomplete information. She had given him the complete picture of a place he had served for decades. She understood the weight of that better than she could articulate. Calder read the maps alone in his study, and then came to find her in the mapping room, with an expression she was learning to read as the one he wore when something had moved him beyond his usual careful containment. He did not say anything elaborate. He sat down across from her and looked at the map of the route for a long time, at the carvings she had documented in their entirety, at the inscription she had translated with the help of the founding records and notated in her precise small handwriting in the Yao margins. He looked at the notes. Then he looked at her. "You translated the entire founding inscription," he said. "It took most of 3 days," she said. "But yes. The records indicate that the founding inscription was considered untranslatable. The records were working from an incomplete understanding of the language," she said. "The key was in the deepest passages, in the sections that had never been fully documented. Once I had mapped those sections and cross-referenced the inscriptions, there, the grammar became clear." She paused. "The founding inscription is not a declaration. It is a letter, from the first alpha to the first reader." He was very still. "I can show you the full translation," she said, "or I can give you privacy with it, whichever you prefer." "Show me," he said quietly. She turned to the marked page in her journal and read it to him, there in the mapping room with Frost under the table, and the northern morning light coming through the narrow windows, a letter 300 years old from a man who had built a citadel and written his most important words into its foundation in a language he shared with only one other person. The letter spoke about what it meant to build something that was meant to last beyond a single life, about the weight of responsibility and the lightness of having someone who understood that weight without requiring it to be explained, about the specific and irreplaceable quality of being known by a person who had chosen to look carefully enough to understand what they were seeing. It ended with something that was not quite a declaration and not quite a prayer, but carried the weight of both. "Wherever you go when this is finished, know that you have already been here. You have already left your mark in these walls. You are already part of what this place is. No distance changes that. No time erases it." She finished reading and was quiet. He was quiet too, for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual and carefully controlled. "She left," he said. "The first reader, after the founding. The records say she continued her work in other territories and came back to Vordheim 3 times over the course of her life, and that each time she came back the wards strengthened." He paused. "They were apart more than they were together." "I know," Seren said. "I read the same records. And it did not diminish what they built." "No," she said. "It did not." He nodded slowly, and she understood. That they were not talking about history at all, or not only about history, and that this was his way of saying something he had been holding carefully since the morning after the ceremony when she had appeared in the mapping room with her field coat and her journal, and her absolute intention to continue being exactly who she was. He was saying that he understood. He was saying that he had read the records too, and that the distance the first reader kept had not been a failure of commitment, but a condition of her nature, and that the citadel had been built to accommodate exactly that, the coming and going of someone who could not be only one thing, who was the cartographer first and the mate second, without those two facts being in conflict. She reached across the map table and covered his hand with hers. "I will always come back," she said. He turned his hand over and held hers. "I know," he said. And in his voice was something that had not been there before the ceremony and was very present now, a quality of settled certainty, the particular peace of a person who has found the thing they did not know they were looking for and has recognized it correctly on the first clear look. She left Fordheim for the first time 6 weeks after the ceremony, in early spring when the northern passes were opening and the first of the 37 territories was accessible enough to survey. She went alone, as she had always worked, with her pack and her instruments and her mapping journal, and a new addition that she had not anticipated. A second journal, smaller, for correspondence, because there were letters to write, and she had decided she was done with the habit of traveling in silence. Frost watched her go from the inner courtyard with the composure of a wolf who had made his peace with the nature of the bond and was not going to embarrass himself by being distraught about it. Calder walked with her to the outer gate. "The Aldravane Highlands first," she said, checking her pack straps. "The maps there are 200 years out of date," he said. "I know. That is why I am going there first. The oldest problems are often the most interesting ones." She straightened up and looked at him. "I will send measurements as I go. For the administrative records. I look forward to receiving them," he said. She looked at him for a moment in the spring light. This man who had spent 11 years making choices that cost him things he would not name, and who had looked at her, a woman with no pack and a birthmark and a professional obsession with knowing exactly where things were, and recognized something that the ancient wards of his citadel had also recognized, and which she was still in the process of learning to recognize fully herself. She stood on her toes and kissed him, briefly and without ceremony, in the way of people for whom the gesture has become familiar enough to be simple. "I will be back by the autumn storms," she said. "I will count on it," he said. She walked through the gate and the northern morning opened up ahead of her, wide and cold and full of unmapped things. And she felt, as she had not felt in any of the mornings of the previous 3 years, that the direction she was moving in was not away from something but toward something, and also, for the first time, back toward something, which was a different quality of motion entirely, and one she had not known she was missing until she had something to return to. Behind her, in the walls of Fordheim, the ancient lanterns burned with their steady warm light. Ahead of her, in the vast unmapped territories of the north, the work waited with the patience of landscapes that had always been there and had simply needed the right pair of eyes to finally see them clearly. She walked on. She was smiling, though there was no one to see it, and the smile was the particular one she kept for moments of accurate identification, for the instant when a map resolved from approximation into certainty, for the experience of knowing exactly where you were and where you were going, and understanding for the first time that these two things were not in opposition. She was a cartographer. She was a foundress. She was a woman walking into the unmapped north with her instruments and her intentions and her mark and her map, and she knew, with the 3 times verified certainty she reserved for things that were real and permanent, that she was finally, completely, and without reservation, exactly where she was supposed to be.